Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korean President Lee Jae Myung is in Vietnam on a state visit, emphasizing what he calls the special relationship between the two countries. President Lee has highlighted not only expanding cooperation in strategic sectors like energy, infrastructure, and technology, but also the deep cultural and historical connections between the two countries. From shared experiences to growing people-to-people exchanges, the relationship is increasingly being described as both strategic and emotional. At the same time, another key layer is drawing attention: soft power. In Vietnam, interest in Korean culture and the Korean language continues to surge, with the Korean wave evolving beyond entertainment into a broader diplomatic asset. So how is Korea's image changing on the ground, and how can that momentum be translated into deeper, more sustainable partnership? For this, we connect to Moon Gi-hong, Assistant Professor of International and Area Studies at Pukyong National University. A big welcome, Professor Moon.
Thank you for having me tonight.
And also joining us online is Nguyen Thi Ha, Professor of Languages and International Studies at Vietnam National University, Hanoi. Good to see you.
Hello, thanks a lot for inviting me.
So let's start a discussion with Professor Moon. Beyond military and economic power, there's a growing emphasis on soft power these days. So in that context, what does the Korean wave represent, and how would you assess the current level of Korea's soft power?
Well, without mentioning so much detail, the Korean wave is the most visible and widely discussed example of Korea's soft power today. Well, Joseph Nye, who coined the term, defines soft power as the ability to attract and then persuade rather than coerce or pay. So the key word is, I think, attraction. When other countries are drawn to your culture, values, and narratives, you gain influence without spending military or economic capital. So by the definition, Korea has developed a genuine soft power. So the scale and the spontaneity of Korean wave is the fact that it grew from commercial entertainment, not just a government public relations campaign, is actually what makes it credible. So being said that, there is also a question worth sitting with, which is how to make this influence more durable. Right now, Korea's soft power is most visible in pop culture, like K-pop, K-drama, K-beauty. And the challenge is to let the energy flow into something deeper, shared values, institutional ties, more genuine policy partnership. So one thing that becomes like clear recently is the culture which isn't limited to entertainment anymore. At today's Korean community luncheon in Hanoi, Kim Sang-sik, the current coach of Vietnam national football team, was actually in the room, and President Lee said it directly: football unites people with one heart. So Vietnam's 13 consecutive win in the first Southeast Asian team ever to achieve that, and reaching to FIFA top 100 for the first time, and the 2018 AFF Championship win under Park Hang-seo, which makes it soft power is now walking through sports as well, not just through streaming chart.
Right. In every other industries, it really puts into perspective how soft power is shaping global influence as well. Now, building on that, President Lee Jae Myung is expected to attend a number of Korean wave-related events during this trip to Vietnam. Dr. Nguyen, just how strong is interest in Korean culture and the Korean language in Vietnam right now, and how influential has it become?
Oh, well, since 1997, when the drama First Love was broadcast on Vietnamese television, it marked the beginning of Korean drama and Hallyu entering Vietnam. And people often say that if you turn on the TV, you will always find a Korean drama. With online platforms, Vietnamese audience can access Korean content almost at the same time as audience in Korea. So on the other hand, interest in Korean language has grown significantly. Currently, there are more than 60 universities in Vietnam offering Korean language or Korean studies programs, with around 50,000 learners in total, and more than half of them are full-time students. I can say Vietnam has one of the largest Korean language education system in Asia. One more thing is now Hallyu has become part of everyday life in Vietnam. K-food, K-beauty, fashion are more than just popular. They are part of daily life. Kimchi, for example, is now a family side dish in many tables. I would say that the influence of Hallyu in Vietnam today is both strong and deeply rooted in many aspects of life.
Wow, it's quite interesting to hear that many of the Vietnamese people are enjoying South Korea's traditional kimchi dish as well. Now, when we take that to further, Dr. Nguyen, what do you think really explains this broad and sustained popularity of the Korean wave in Vietnam?
Well, I think there are several key reasons combining economic, cultural, and political factors. Today, Korea is the largest investor and also strategic trade partner of Vietnam. There are about 10,000 Korean companies in the country. Then there's a strong sense of cultural familiarity. Korean content emphasizes values like family, education, social relationships, which are very close to Vietnamese values, making it easy for audience to relate. The quality of K content is very high. All are well produced and continuously innovative that have sustaining long-term interest. Another important reason is that Hallyu has been supported by a strategic approach from both the government and industry. For example, chaebols like LG has sponsored a large number of Korean dramas to broadcast in Vietnam during many first years, helping build a positive national image about Korea. Finally, Vietnamese audience are highly active. Fans participate through communities, creating content, organizing social activities, and so on. So I can say that Hallyu success comes from a combination of strong push factors from Korea and equally important pull factors within Vietnam.
So it really suggests that this is more than just a passing trend over there. In fact, some analysis suggests that this popularity is driven not just by content, but also by a shared emotional, cultural, and even historical connections between the two countries. Professor Moon, what is your view on that?
Well, yes, as you mentioned, I think that's exactly right. First of all, I think that the two countries share similar cultural foundation, which matters enormously. So Korea and Vietnam and Korea share a Confucian cultural heritage with the emphasis on family bonds, respect for elders, the value placed on education and collective identity. Well, these are not just abstract similarity, but they created a sense of recognition when Vietnamese audiences watch Korean dramas. So the emotional logic of the stories, filial duty, sacrifice, social aspiration, well, that's the familiar than the foreign. So that's a real advantage of Korea. Korean content has in Vietnam or something. It's simply does not have in Western market, I reckon. So President Lee in the luncheon mentioned that the Vietnamese folktale called Tom Cam, which is remarkably similar to Korea's own Kongji Pachi. The stories are very different places sharing the same moral architecture, perseverance through hardship and the triumph of virtue. So that's not just coincidence. So it's evidence of how deeply a shared worldview is embedded in both cultures. So at the level of story and imagination. Well, that's not just the formal value anymore. So there is also a historical dimension, as you mentioned, as you said, that goes back further than most people realize. So which is stretches back 800 years of the history. So I think this human connection is really something that the Korean wave's popularity in Vietnam makes real.
So it's really not just content, but deeper connections at play here. Now, in the past, Korea was often seen in Vietnam mainly through the lens of economic development and business. Dr. Nguyen, since the rise of the Korean wave, how has that perception changed within the Vietnamese society?
Korea is a role model of economic development with the well-known Hangang miracle. This is a source of motivation for a country like Vietnam, also starting from the scratch to take off. This image still remains today. Korea provides Vietnam with many lessons on the success of especially cultural industry or high-tech industry. K-culture presents Korea as modern, creative, standard of beauty, and globally influential. This has made Korea especially attractive to younger generation in Vietnam. That's why many Vietnamese people now see Korea also as a destination for study and cultural experience. At the same time, Vietnamese audience through video channels are exposed to everyday life in Korea. They see changes in family relationships, emerging social issues, and even personal struggles. Overall, the image of Korea in Vietnam has become much closer, more multidimensional, and more engaging to the people.
So it seems people-to-people exchanges have become more familiar and intimate between the two sides. Now, as we've mentioned a while ago, we're really seeing a surge in Korean language learning in Vietnam, along with institutional changes like TOPIK scores being reflected in university admissions as well. Professor Moon, what does this trend mean in terms of people-to-people exchanges and public diplomacy between Seoul and Hanoi?
So the decision made by Vietnamese Ministry of Education to formally recognize TOPIK scores in university admissions from this year is genuinely significant. Well, I don't think it's fully appreciated yet. It shows how much it changes the dynamic. So when a language goes from being a hobby to a university entrance qualification, well, that shows there's something fundamental shift. So it's no longer about just culture enthusiasm alone. It becomes a life strategy. Probably Vietnamese students or maybe I don't know, their parents are now doing some sort of calculations because current language proficiency opens doors to Korean companies in Vietnam and to study opportunity in South Korea and to career path that didn't exist a generation ago. So I even heard like people joking that Korean does more for resume than English these days. So the public diplomacy implications here are really, I think, significant. So for example, like government cultural programs like Kim Sejong Institute, Public Center, and exchange scholarship are important. So I think the next generation is already like stepping up. We heard today that 40% of elementary students at the Hanoi Korean International School are second generation of Korea Vietnam children. Some of them are actually supported interpretation for this state visit. So I think the honest question for Korea to ask is whether this is genuinely reciprocal. Korean languages entering Korea Vietnamese university. What is Korea doing to learn Vietnamese culture in turn? So that asymmetry, if left unaddressed, will eventually become an issue as well.
So more of Koreans would have to gain as much as interest in Vietnamese language as well moving forward. Now, in that context, many people argue that the Korean wave should be leveraged not just as a cultural content, but as a public diplomacy asset, like our Professor Moon has mentioned. So from Vietnam's perspective, Dr. Nguyen, what kind of strategic approach should Korea take?
So far, thanks to the Korean wave, national image of Korea in Vietnam has been extremely positive. However, there's one aspect that may not be very visible, but I think it's still important to mention. The more similarities there are, especially in terms of culture between two countries, the more people tend to expect similar ways of thinking and behaving. As a result, some small cultural differences between the two countries can be overlooked or not fully recognized, and this can sometimes lead to misunderstandings or even small conflicts. In this context, I think the concept of cultural literacy becomes very important. This means people of two countries should understand the traditions, regular activities, and history of each other. In a country like Vietnam, where national identity and cultural pride are quite strong, understanding local cultural meanings is essential. Also, public diplomacy is not carried out by governments alone. Artists and companies are actually key actors in this process. For example, when organizing concerts or events, working with local experts or cultural advisors can ensure a much more careful and appropriate approach. So I think the key is to move from cultural export to cultural understanding and two-way partnership.
Cultural understanding, that would be very important in this context. But speaking of reciprocity a while ago, Professor Dr. Nguyen, for cultural exchanges to be truly mutual, what kind of Vietnamese culture or content do you think deserve greater exposure here in South Korea?
Well, I would say there are quite a lot. I believe Vietnam has a rich and diverse cultural heritage that deserves to be introduced more widely. First, traditional culture is key strength. With a history of over 500 years and 54 ethnic groups, Vietnam offers a wide range of unique cultural expressions, from music, performing arts, to festivals. However, when it comes to purely traditional culture, I think there is still a certain gap in making it more accessible and relatable to a broader audience. Recently, we are seeing the rise of a pop folk trend where traditional elements are blended with modern music. Some of these songs have even gone viral globally, which shows the strong potential of Vietnamese culture to connect with international audience. Apart from that, Vietnamese cuisine, contemporary Vietnamese content, or just daily lifestyle such as coffee culture, street life, youth culture, all present a dynamic and relatable image of modern Vietnam. Altogether, I think if Vietnamese culture is shared through compelling stories with a strategic promotion system, it can create stronger connections with Korean audience.
Right, but there's no doubt that many of the Korean citizens really are in love with Vietnamese cuisine, and let's hope we would gain more interest in other cultural aspects as well. But finally, before we conclude our discussion tonight, Professor Moon, what direction do you think should South Korea's public diplomacy towards Vietnam actually take? And beyond the short-term spread of the Korean wave, what is the most important task for Korea to establish itself as a genuine partner in Vietnamese society?
Well, I have conducted a research with one of the Vietnamese PhD students under my supervision. The research shows that the reception of Korean culture in Vietnam is not only one-way street. Like Vietnamese audiences are not passive consumers; they actively negotiate, select, and resist embracing what resonates while pushing back against what feels like imposition. So the first priority, I reckon, is the people who are already doing sort of this work. There are roughly 100,000 of Korean Vietnamese multicultural families in Korea, tens of thousands of Vietnamese students studying here, and also hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese workers who's experiencing Korea's that shapes how Vietnam understand this country. So these are Korea's most credible public diplomats. So not because they were appointed, but because their lives are the relationship. I think the second honest engagement with the historical complexity. The Korean wave has created genuine warmth between younger generations. But as I mentioned, but durable partnership requires the courage to acknowledge different difficult chapters. So including the Vietnamese war and the experience of Korean companies operating in Vietnam. So genuine partners do not pretend history is simpler than it is. So yes, that's, I think, what we need to make our relationship durable in the near future.
Right. So ultimately, we will look forward to building a long-term sustainable partnership between the two countries. Thank you so much for your insights tonight, Professor Moon.
Thank you.
And of course, Dr. Nguyen as well. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.